The Pied Piper of Hamelin. A very long time ago, the town of Hamelin in Germany was invaded by bands of rats, the likes of which had never been seen before nor ever will be again. They were great black creatures which ran boldly in broad daylight through the streets and swarmed all over the houses, so that people at last couldn't put hand or foot down anywhere without touching one. When dressing in the morning, they found rats in their breeches and petticoats, in their pockets and in their boots. And when they wanted a morsel to eat, the voracious horde had swept away everything from cellar to garret. The night time was even worse. As soon as the lights were out, these untiring nibblers set to work, and everywhere, in the ceilings, in the floors, in the cupboards, at the doors, there was a chase and a rummage, and so furious a noise of gimlets, pincers, and saws that a deaf man could not rest for even 1 hour. Neither cats, nor dogs, nor poison, nor traps, nor prayers, nor candles burned to all the saints, nothing did any good. The more rats they killed, the more came. But one Friday there arrived in the town a man with an odd face, who played the bagpipes and sang this refrain. Who lives shall see, this is he, the rat-catcher. He was a tall, gawky fellow, dry and bronzed, with a crooked nose, a long rat-tail moustache, 2 great yellow, piercing and mocking eyes under a large felt hat, set off by a scarlet cock's feather. He was dressed in a green jacket with a leather belt and orange breeches, and on his feet were sandals fastened by thongs passed around his legs in the gypsy fashion. That is how he may be seen to this day, painted on a window of the cathedral of Hamelin. He stopped in the great marketplace before the town hall, turned his back to the church, and went on with his music, singing, Who lives shall see, this is he, the rat-catcher. The town council had just assembled to consider once more this plague of Egypt, from which no one could save the town. The stranger sent word to the councillors that if they would make it worth his while, he would rid them of all their rats before night fell. Then he's a sorcerer, cried the citizens with one voice. We must beware of him. The chief town councillor, who was considered clever, reassured them. He said, Sorcerer or no, if this bagpiper speaks the truth, it was he who sent us this horrible vermin he wants to rid us of today for money. Well, we must learn to catch the devil in his own snares. You leave it to me. Leave it to the town councillor, said the citizens one to another. And the stranger was brought before them. Before night, he said, I shall have dispatched all the rats in Hamelin if you will but pay me a shilling a head. A shilling a head, cried the citizens. But that will come to millions of shillings. The chief town councillor simply shrugged his shoulders and said to the stranger, A bargain. The rats will be paid for at 1 shilling a head, as you ask. The bagpiper announced he would begin that very evening when the moon rose. He added that the inhabitants should at that hour leave the streets free and content themselves with looking out of their windows at the pleasant spectacle that was passing. When the people of Hamelin heard of the bargain, they too exclaimed, A shilling a head? But this will cost us a great deal of money. Leave it to the town councillor, said the town council with a malicious air. And the good people of Hamelin repeated, Leave it to the town councillor. Towards evening, the bagpiper reappeared in the marketplace. As at first, he turned his back to the church, and the moment the moon rose on the horizon, the bagpipes resounded, Tra-li-ra-ta-wing. It was first a slow, caressing sound, then more and more lively and urgent, and so sonorous and piercing that it penetrated the furthest alleys and retreats of the town. Soon, from the bottom of cellars, the top of garrets, from under all the furniture, from all the nooks and corners of the houses, out came the rats, searching for the door, flinging themselves into the street, and trip, 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 they began to run in file towards the front of the town hall, so squeezed together that they covered the pavement like the waves of a flooded torrent. When the square was quite full, the bagpiper faced about, and still playing briskly, turned towards the river that runs at the foot of the walls of Hamlin. Arriving there, he turned around. The rats were following. "Hop, hop," he cried, pointing with his finger to the middle of the stream, where the water whirled and was drawn down as if through a funnel, and hop, hop, without hesitating, the rats took the leap, swam straight to the funnel, plunged in head foremost, and disappeared. The plunging continued thus without ceasing till midnight. At last, dragging himself with difficulty, came a big rat, white with age, who stopped on the bank. This was the king of the band. "Are they all there, friend Blanchett?" asked the bagpiper. "They are all there," replied the white rat. "And how many were they?" 990,999. "Well reckoned?" "Well reckoned." "Then go and join them, old sir, and au revoir." And the old white rat sprang in his turn into the river, swam to the whirlpool, and disappeared. When the bagpiper had thus concluded his business, he went to bed at his inn, and for the first time in 3 months, the people of Hamlin slept quietly through the night. The next morning at 9 o'clock, the bagpiper appeared at the town hall, where the town council awaited him. "All your rats took a jump into the river yesterday," he said to the councillors, "and I guarantee that not one of them comes back. They were 990,999 at a shilling a head. Reckon." "Let us reckon the heads first. 1 shilling a head is 1 head the shilling. Where are the heads?" The piper didn't expect this treacherous stroke. He paled with anger, and his eyes flashed fire. "The heads," cried he. "If you care about them, go and find them in the river." "So," replied the chief councillor, "you refuse to honour the terms of your agreement. We ourselves could refuse you all payment. But you have been of use to us, and we will not let you go without a recompense." With this, he offered the piper 50 shillings. "Keep your recompense for yourself," replied the piper proudly. "If you do not pay me, I will be paid by your heirs." Thereupon, he pulled his hat down over his eyes, went hastily out of the hall, and left the town without speaking to a soul. When the people of Hamlin heard how the affair had ended, they rubbed their hands, and with no more scruple than their town councillors, laughed about the bagpiper, who, they said, had been caught in his own trap. But what made them laugh above all was his threat of getting himself paid by their heirs. Oh, they wished they could only have such creditors for the rest of their lives. Next day, which was a Sunday, they went gaily to church, thinking that afterwards they would at last be able to eat some good thing that the rats hadn't tasted before them. They never suspected the terrible surprise that awaited them on their return home. No children anywhere. They'd all disappeared. Our children! What? Our children! Where are our poor children? Was the cry that was soon heard in all the streets. Then through the east gate of the town came 3 little boys who cried and wept, and this is the story they told. While the parents were at church, a wonderful music had sounded in the streets, Soon all the little boys and all the little girls who had been left at home, attracted by the magic sounds, had gone out to the great marketplace. There they found the piper playing his bagpipes. Then the stranger started to walk quickly, and they had followed, running, singing, and dancing to the sound of the music, as far as the foot of the mountain which one sees on entering Hamelin. At their approach, the mountain had opened a little, and the bagpiper had gone in with them, after which it had closed again. Only the three little ones who told of the adventure had remained outside, as if by a miracle. One was lame and could not run fast enough. The second, who had left the house in haste, one foot shod, the other bare, had hurt himself against a big stone and could scarcely walk. The third had arrived on time, but while hurrying to go in, had struck so violently against the wall of the mountain that he fell backwards at the moment it closed upon his comrades. Hearing this story, the parents redoubled their lamentations. They ran with pikes and mattocks to the mountain and searched till evening to find the opening through which their children had disappeared. Without success. At last, the night falling, they returned desolate to Hamelin. But the most unhappy was the town councillor who had bargained with the piper, for he had lost 3 sons and 2 daughters, and to crown all, the people of Hamelin overwhelmed him with reproaches, forgetting that the day before they had agreed with him. What had become of these unfortunate children? The parents always hoped that they were not dead, and that the piper, who certainly must have come out of the mountain, would have taken them with him to his own country. That is why they sent in search of them to many faraway countries, but no one ever found a trace of the poor little ones. And even though there are no longer any of the fathers, mothers, brothers, or sisters of that day left, they still tell the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The colony of cats. Long, long ago, as far back as the time when animals spoke, there lived a community of cats in a deserted house not far from a large town. They had everything they could possibly desire for their comfort. They were well fed and well lodged, and if by any chance an unlucky mouse was stupid enough to venture in their way, they caught it, not to eat, but for the pure pleasure of catching it. The old people of the town related how they had heard their parents speak of a time when the whole country was so overrun with rats and mice that not so much as a grain of corn was to be gathered in the fields, and it might be out of gratitude to the cats who had rid the country of these plagues that their descendants were allowed to live in peace. No one knows where the cats got the money to pay for everything, or who paid it, for all this happened so very long ago. But one thing is certain. They were rich enough to keep a servant, for though they lived very happily together and did not scratch or fight more than human beings would have done, they were not clever enough to do the housework themselves, and preferred at all events to have someone to cook their meat, which they scorned to eat raw. Not only were they very difficult to please about the housework, but most women quickly tired of living alone with only cats for companions, and consequently they never kept a servant long. It had become a saying in the town, when anyone found herself reduced to her last penny, "I will go and live with the cats," and many a poor woman actually did so. Now Lizina was not happy at home, for her mother, who was a widow, was much fonder of her elder daughter. Often the younger one fared very badly and had not enough to eat, while her sister could have everything she desired, and if Lizina dared to complain, she was certain to receive a good beating. At last the day came when she was at the end of her patience, and she exclaimed to her mother and sister, "Since you hate me so much, you'll be glad to get rid of me, so I'm going to live with the cats." "Away with you," cried her mother, seizing an old broom handle from behind the door. Poor Lizina did not wait to be told twice, but ran off at once, and never stopped till she reached the door of the cat's house. Their cook had left them that very morning with her face all scratched, the result of such a quarrel with the head of the house that he had nearly clawed out her eyes. Lizina was therefore very warmly welcomed, and she set to work at once to prepare the dinner, not without many misgivings as to the taste of the cats and whether she would be able to satisfy them. Going to and fro about her work, she found herself frequently hindered by a constant succession of cats who appeared one after another in the kitchen to inspect the new servant. She had one in front of her feet, another perched on the back of her chair while she peeled vegetables, a third sat on the table beside her, and 5 or 6 others prowled about among the pots and pans on the shelves against the wall. The air resounded with their purring, which meant they were pleased with their new maid. But Lizina had not yet learned to understand their language, and often she did not know what they wanted her to do. However, as she was a good, kind-hearted girl, she set to work to pick up the little kittens which tumbled about on the floor. She patched up quarrels and nursed on her lap a big tabby, the oldest of the community, which had a lame paw. All these kindnesses could hardly fail to make a favourable impression on the cats, and it was even better after a while when Lizina had become accustomed to their strange ways. Never had the house been kept so clean, the meat so well served, nor the sick cats so well cared for. Some weeks later, they had a visit from an old cat whom they called their father, who lived by himself in a barn at the top of the hill, and came down from time to time to inspect the little colony. He too was much taken with Lizina, and on seeing her asked, "Are you well served by this nice black-eyed little person?" And the cats answered with one voice, "Oh, yes, Father Gatto, we have never had so good a servant." At each of his visits the answer was always the same. But after a time the old cat, who was very observant, noticed that the little maid was looking sadder and sadder. "What is the matter, my child? Has anyone been unkind to you?" he asked one day, when he found her almost crying in her kitchen. She burst into tears and answered between her sobs, "Oh, no, they're all very good to me, but I long for news of home, and I pine to see my mother and sister." Father Gatto, being a sensible old cat, understood the little servant's feelings. "You shall go home," he said, "and you shall not come back here unless you please. But first you must be rewarded for your kind services to my children. Follow me down into the inner cellar, where you've never been before, for I always keep it locked and carry the key away with me." Lizina looked around her in astonishment as they went down into the great vaulted cellar underneath the kitchen. Before her stood 2 big earthenware water jars, one of which contained oil, the other a liquid shining like gold. "Into which of these jars shall I dip you?" asked Father Gatto, with a grin that showed all his sharp white teeth, while his moustaches stood out straight on either side of his face. The little maid looked at the 2 jars from under her long dark lashes. "In the oil jar," she answered timidly, thinking to herself, "I could not ask to be bathed in gold." But Father Gatto replied, "No, no, you have deserved something better than that," and seizing her in his strong paws, he plunged her into the liquid gold. Wonder of wonders! When Lizina came out of the jar, she shone from head to foot like the sun in the heavens on a fine summer's day. Her pretty pink cheeks and long black hair alone kept their natural colour, but otherwise she had become like a statue of pure gold. Father Gatto purred loudly with satisfaction. "Go home," he said, "and see your mother and sister. But take care, if you hear the cock crow, to turn towards it. If, on the contrary, the donkey brays, you must look the other way." The little maid, having gratefully kissed the white paw of the old cat, set off for home. Just as she got near her mother's house, the cock crowed, and quickly she turned towards it. Immediately, a beautiful golden star appeared on her forehead, crowning her glossy black hair. At the same time, the donkey began to bray, but Lizina took care not to look over the fence into the field where the donkey was feeding. Her mother and sister, who were in front of their house, uttered cries of admiration and astonishment when they saw her, and their cries became still louder when Lizina, taking her handkerchief from her pocket, drew out a handful of gold also. For some days the mother and her 2 daughters lived very happily together. for Lizina had given them everything she had brought away except her golden clothing, for that would not come off, in spite of all the efforts of her sister, who was madly jealous of her good fortune. The golden star, too, could not be removed from her forehead, but the gold pieces she drew from her pockets had found their way to her mother and sister. "I will go now and see what I can get out of the pussy-cats," said Peppina, the elder girl, one morning, as she took Lizina's basket and fastened her purses into her own skirt. "I should like some of the cat's gold for myself," she thought, as she left her mother's house before the sun rose. The cat colony had not yet hired another servant, for they knew they could never get one to replace Lizina, whose loss they had not ceased to mourn. When they heard that Peppina was her sister, they ran to meet her. "She's not the least like her," the kittens whispered among themselves. "Shh! Hush, be quiet," the older cat said. "All servants cannot be pretty." No, decidedly, she was not at all like Lizina. Even the most reasonable and generous of the cats soon acknowledged that. The very first day she shut the kitchen door in the faces of the tomcats, who used to enjoy watching Lizina at her work, and a young and mischievous cat, who jumped in by the open kitchen window and alighted on the table, got such a blow with a rolling pin that he squalled for an hour. With every day that passed, the household became more and more aware of its misfortune. The work was as badly done as the servant was surly and disagreeable. Heaps of dust collected in the corners of the rooms. Spiders' webs hung from the ceilings and in front of the window panes. The beds were hardly ever made, and the feather beds, so beloved by the old and feeble cats, had never once been shaken since Lizina left the house. At Father Gatto's next visit, he found the whole colony in a great state of uproar. "Caesar has one paw so badly swollen that it looks as if it were broken," said one. "Peppina kicked him with her great wooden shoes. Hector has an abscess on his back where a wooden chair was flung at him. And Agrippina's 3 little kittens have died of hunger as well as their mother, because Peppina forgot them in their basket up in the attic. There's no putting up with the creature. Do send her away, Father Gatto. Lizina herself would not be angry with us. She must know very well what her sister is like." "Come here," said Father Gatto, in his most severe tones to Peppina. And he took her down into the cellar and showed her the same 2 great jars that he had shown Lizina. "Into which of these shall I dip you?" he asked, and she made haste to answer, "In the liquid gold," for she was no more modest than she was good and kind. Father Gatto's yellow eyes darted fire. "You have not deserved it," he uttered in a voice like thunder, and seizing her, he flung her into the jar of oil, where she was nearly suffocated. When she came to the surface, screaming and struggling, the vengeful cat seized her again and rolled her in the ash heap on the floor. Then when she rose, dirty, blinded, and disgusting to behold, he thrust her from the door, saying, "Begone! And when you meet a braying donkey, be careful to turn your head towards it." Stumbling and raging, Peppina set off for home, thinking herself fortunate to find a stick by the wayside with which to support herself. She was within sight of her mother's house when she heard the voice of a donkey loudly braying in the meadow on the right. Quickly she turned her head towards it, and at the same time put her hand up to her forehead, where, waving like a plume, was a donkey's tail. She ran home to her mother at full speed, yelling with rage and despair, and it took Lizina 2 hours with a big basin of hot water and 2 cakes of soap to wash off the layer of oil and ashes with which Father Gatto had adorned her. As for the donkey's tail, it was impossible to get rid of that. It was as firmly fixed on her forehead as was the golden star on Lizina's. Their mother was furious. She first beat Lizina unmercifully with the broom. Then she took her to the mouth of the well and lowered her into it. She went away, leaving her stranded at the bottom, weeping and crying for help. Before this happened, however, the king's son, in passing the mother's house one day, had seen Lizina sitting and sewing in the parlour and had been dazzled by her beauty. After coming back 2 or 3 times, he at last ventured to approach the window and to whisper in the softest voice, "Lovely maiden, will you be my bride?" And she had answered, "I will." Next morning, when the prince arrived to claim his bride, he found her wrapped in a large white veil. "It is thus that maidens are received from their parents' hands," said the mother, who hoped to make the king's son marry Peppina in place of her sister, and had fastened the donkey's tail around her head like a lock of hair under the veil. The prince was young and a little timid, so he made no objections, and he seated Peppina in the carriage beside him. Their way led past the old house inhabited by the cats. They were all at the window, for the report had got about that the prince was going to marry the most beautiful maiden in the world, on whose forehead shone a golden star, and they knew that this could only be their adored Lizina. As the carriage slowly passed in front of the old house, where cats from all parts of the world seemed to be gathered, a song burst from every throat. "Mew, mew, mew! Prince, look quick behind you! In the well is fair Lizina! You have nothing but Peppina! Mew, mew, mew!" When he heard this, the coachman, who understood the cat's language better than the prince did, stopped the horses and asked, "Does your highness know what the Grimalkins are saying?" The song broke forth again, louder than ever. With a turn of his hand, the prince threw back the white veil and discovered beneath it the puffed-up, swollen face of Peppina, with the donkey's tail twisted around her head. "Ah, traitoress!" he exclaimed, quivering with rage. And ordering the horses to be turned around, he drove the elder daughter back to the woman who had sought to deceive him. With his hand on the hilt of his sword, he demanded Lizina in so fierce a voice that the mother hastened to the well to draw her prisoner out. Lizina's clothing and her star shone so brilliantly that when the prince led her home to the king his father, the whole palace was lit up. Next day they were married and lived happily ever after, and all the cats, headed by old Father Gatto, were at the wedding. Thumbelina. There was once a woman who wanted to have a tiny little child, but she didn't know where to get one. So one day she went to an old witch and said to her, "I should so much like to have a tiny little child. Can you tell me where I might get one?" "Oh, we have one ready now," said the witch. "Here, take this barley corn. It's not the kind the farmer sows in his field or feeds the cocks and hens with, I can tell you. Put it in a flower pot, and then you will see what happens." "Oh, thank you," said the woman, and gave the witch 12 pennies, for that was what the barley corn cost. Then she went home and planted it. Immediately there grew from it a large and beautiful flower which looked like a tulip, but the petals were tightly closed as if it was still only a bud. "What a beautiful flower!" exclaimed the woman, and she kissed the red and yellow petals. As she kissed them, the flower burst open. It was a real tulip, the kind we usually see, but in the middle of the blossom, on the soft velvety petals, sat a tiny girl, delicate and pretty. She was scarcely as big as a thumb, so the woman and her husband called her Thumbelina. An elegant polished walnut shell served Thumbelina as a cradle. The blue petals of a violet were her mattress, and a rose petal was her quilt. There she lay at night, but in the daytime she used to play about on the table. Here the woman had put a bowl, which was surrounded by a ring of flowers, their stems dipping into the water, where a great tulip petal floated. In this Thumbelina sat and sailed from one side of the bowl to the other, rowing herself with 2 white horsehairs for oars. It was such a pretty sight. She would sing, too, with a voice more soft and sweet than had ever been heard before. One night, when she was lying in her pretty bed, an old toad crept in through a broken pane in the window. She was very ugly and clumsy, and she hopped onto the table where Thumbelina lay asleep under the red rose petal. "Ooh, this would make a beautiful wife for my son," said the toad. Taking up the walnut shell with Thumbelina inside, she hopped with it through the window into the garden. Here there flowed a great wide stream, with slippery and marshy banks, where the toad lived with her son. Ooh, how ugly and clammy he was, just like his mother. Croak, 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 was all he could say when he saw the pretty little girl asleep in the walnut shell. Now, don't talk so loud or you'll wake her, said the old toad. She might escape us even now. She's as light as a feather. We will put her out on a broad water lily leaf in the stream. She's so small and light it'll be just like an island for her. She can't run away from us there while we're preparing the guest room under the marsh where she will live. Growing in the stream were many water lilies with broad green leaves which looked as if they were floating on the water. The farthest leaf was the largest, and to this the old toad swam with Thumbelina in her walnut shell. The tiny Thumbelina woke up very early in the morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry bitterly. On every side of the great green leaf was water, and she couldn't get back to the land. The old toad was down under the marsh, decorating her room with rushes and yellow marigold petals to make it grand for her new daughter-in-law. After she'd finished, she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina lay. She wanted to take the pretty cradle to the room before Thumbelina herself went there. The old toad bowed low in the water before her and said, "Here is my son. You shall marry him, and the two of you will live in great magnificence down under the marsh." Croak, 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 was all the son could say. Then they took the neat little cradle and swam away with it. Thumbelina sat alone on the great green leaf and wept, for she didn't want to live with the toad or marry her ugly son. The little fishes swimming about under the water had seen the old toad quite plainly and heard what she said. They raised their heads to see Thumbelina and thought her so pretty. They were very sorry she was going down to live with the ugly toad. No, that must not happen, they decided. They assembled in the water around the green stalk which supported the leaf on which the tiny girl was sitting and nibbled the stem in two. Away floated the leaf down the stream, bearing Thumbelina far beyond the reach of the toad. On she sailed past several towns, and the birds sitting in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a pretty little girl." The leaf floated farther and farther away. Thus Thumbelina left her native land. A beautiful little white butterfly fluttered above her, and at last settled on the leaf. Thumbelina pleased him, and she too was delighted. Now the toads couldn't reach her, and everything was so beautiful where she was sailing. The sun shone on the water and made it sparkle like the brightest silver. She took off her sash and tied one end around the butterfly, the other end she fastened to the leaf, so that he glided along with her faster than ever. Soon after, a great beetle came flying past. He caught sight of Thumbelina, and in a moment had put his legs around her slender waist and had flown off with her to a tree. The green leaf floated away down the stream, and the butterfly with it, for he was fastened to the leaf and couldn't get loose. How terrified poor little Thumbelina was when the beetle flew off with her to the tree. And she was especially distressed for the beautiful white butterfly, because she'd tied him to the leaf. If he didn't get away, he might starve to death. But the beetle didn't trouble himself about that. He sat down with her on a large green leaf, gave her honey out of the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, although she wasn't in the least like a beetle. Later on, all the other beetles who lived in the same tree came to pay calls. They examined Thumbelina closely and remarked, "Why, she's only 2 legs. How disgusting!" "She's no feelers," cried another. "Oh, how ugly she is," said all the lady beetles. And yet Thumbelina was really very pretty. The beetle who had stolen her knew this very well, but when he heard all the ladies saying she was ugly, he began to think so too, and decided not to keep her. She could go wherever she liked, so he flew down from the tree with her and put her on a daisy. There she sat and wept, thinking she must be very ugly, because the beetle would have nothing to do with her. Yet she was really the most beautiful creature imaginable, so soft and delicate, like the loveliest rose petal. The whole summer, poor little Thumbelina lived alone in the great wood. She wove a bed for herself of blades of grass, and hung it up under a clover leaf so she was protected from the rain. She gathered honey from the flowers for food, and drank the dew on the leaves every morning. Thus the summer and autumn passed. But then came winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung so sweetly about her had flown away. The trees had shed their leaves, the flowers were dead. The great clover leaf under which she lived had curled up, and nothing remained but the withered stalk. She was terribly cold, for her clothes were ragged, and she herself was so small and thin. Poor little Thumbelina would surely be frozen to death very soon. It began to snow, and every snowflake that fell on her was like a whole shovelful, for she was only an inch high. She wrapped herself up in a dead leaf, but since it was torn in the middle, it gave her no warmth. She was trembling with cold. Now, just outside the wood where she was living lay a great grain field. The grain had been harvested a long time before. Only dry, bare stubble was left standing in the frozen ground. This made a forest for her to wander about in. All at once, she came across the door of a field mouse, who had a little hole under a knoll. There the mouse lived, warm and snug, with a storeroom full of grain, a splendid kitchen and dining room. Poor little Thumbelina went up to the door and begged for a little piece of barley, for she had not had anything to eat for 2 days. "Poor little creature," said the field mouse, for she was a kind-hearted old thing. "Come into my warm room and have some dinner with me." Because Thumbelina pleased her, she said, "As far as I'm concerned, you may spend the winter with me. You must keep my room clean and tidy, and tell me stories, for I like them very much." And Thumbelina did all that the kind field mouse asked, and did it remarkably well too. "I'm expecting a visitor tonight," said the field mouse. "My neighbour comes to call on me once a week. He's in better circumstances than I am. He has great big rooms and wears a fine black velvet coat. Oh, if you could only marry him, you'd be well provided for, though he's blind. You must tell him all the prettiest stories you know." But Thumbelina didn't trouble her head about him, for he was only a mole. He came and paid them a visit in his black velvet coat. "Oh, he's so rich and accomplished," the field mouse told her. "His house is 20 times larger than mine. He possesses great knowledge, but he cannot bear the sun and the beautiful flowers, and speaks slightingly of them, for he's never seen them." Thumbelina had to sing to him, so she sang, ladybird, fly away home," and other songs so prettily that the mole fell in love with her. He didn't say anything. He was a very cautious man. A short time before, he had dug a long passage through the ground from his own house to that of his neighbour. He gave the field mouse and Thumbelina permission to walk in this as often as they liked, but he begged them not to be afraid of the dead bird that lay in the passage. It was a real bird with beak and feathers, and must have died a long time ago. It now lay buried just where the mole had made his tunnel. One day the mole led Thumbelina and the field mouse into the tunnel. He took a piece of tinder wood in his mouth, for that glows in the dark, and went ahead of them, lighting their way through the long dark passage. When they came to the place where the dead bird lay, the mole put his broad nose against the ceiling and pushed a hole through so the daylight could shine down. In the middle of the path lay a dead swallow, his pretty wings pressed close to his sides, his claws and head drawn under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of cold. Thumbelina was very sorry, for she was fond of all little birds. They had sung and twittered so beautifully to her all through the summer. But the mole kicked the bird with his bandy legs and said, "Now he can't sing any more. Must be miserable to be a little bird. I'm thankful that none of my children are. Birds always starve in winter." "Yes, you speak like a sensible man," said the field mouse. "What has a bird, in spite of all his singing, in the winter time? He can only starve and freeze, and that must be very unpleasant for him, I must say." Thumbelina didn't say anything. When the other two had passed on, she bent down to the bird, brushed aside the feathers from his head, and kissed his closed eyes gently. "Perhaps he sang to me in the summer," she said. "How much pleasure he did give me, dear little bird." The mole closed up the hole which let in the light and then escorted the ladies home. But Thumbelina couldn't sleep that night. She got out of bed and wove a big blanket of straw and carried it off and spread it over the dead bird. She piled upon it thistledown as soft as cotton wool, which she had found in the field mouse's room so that the poor little thing should lie warmly buried. "Farewell, pretty little bird," she said. "Farewell, and thank you for your beautiful songs in the summer when the trees were green and the sun shone down so warmly on us." Then she laid her head against the bird's heart. But the bird was not dead. He had been frozen, but now that she had warmed him, he was coming to life again. In autumn, the swallows fly away to foreign lands. But there are some who are late in starting, and then they get so cold they drop down as if dead, and the snow comes and covers them over. Thumbelina trembled. She was so frightened. The bird was very large to her, for she was only an inch high. But she took courage, piled up the down more closely around the poor swallow, fetched her own little quilt and laid it over his head. Next night she crept out again to him. There he was, alive, but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment and look at Thumbelina, who was standing in front of him with a piece of tinderwood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, pretty little child," said the swallow to her. "I'm so beautifully warm. Soon I shall regain my strength, and I shall be able to fly out once more into the warm sunshine." "Oh," said Thumbelina, "oh, it's very cold outside. It's snowing and freezing. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought him water in a petal, which he drank. He told her how he had torn one of his wings on a bramble so he couldn't keep up with the other swallows, who had flown far away to warmer lands. At last he had dropped down exhausted, and then he couldn't remember any more. The whole winter he remained down there, and Thumbelina looked after him and nursed him tenderly. She told neither the mole nor the field mouse anything of this, for they couldn't bear the poor swallow. When the spring came, and the sun warmed the earth again, the swallow said farewell to Thumbelina, who opened for him the hole in the roof the mole had made. The sun shone down brightly upon her, and the swallow asked her if she'd go with him. She could sit upon his back. Thumbelina wanted very much to fly far away into the green wood, but she knew that the old field mouse would be sad if she ran away. "No, I mustn't come," she said. "Farewell, dear good little girl," said the swallow, and flew off into the sunshine. Thumbelina gazed after him with tears in her eyes, for she was very fond of the swallow. Sang the bird and flew into the greenwood. Thumbelina was very unhappy. She wasn't allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The grain which had been sowed in the field over the field mouse's home grew up high into the air and made a thick forest for the poor little girl, who was only an inch high. "Soon you're to be a bride, Thumbelina," said the field mouse one day, "for our neighbour has said he wishes to marry you. What a piece of fortune for a poor child like you. Now you must set to work on your trousseau, for nothing must be lacking if you're to become the wife of our neighbour, the mole." Thumbelina had to sew all day long, and every evening the mole visited her and told her that when the summer was over the sun would not shine so hot. Now it was burning the earth as hard as a stone. Yes, when the summer had passed, they would have the wedding. But she was not at all pleased about it, for she didn't like the stupid mole. Every morning when the sun was rising, and every evening when it was setting, she would steal out of the house door, and when the breeze parted the stalks of grain so that she could see the clear sky through them, she thought how bright and beautiful it must be outside, and longed to see her dear swallow again. But he never came. No doubt he had flown far away into the great greenwood. By the autumn, Thumbelina had finished her whole trousseau. "In 4 weeks you'll be married," said the field mouse. But Thumbelina wept and declared she would not marry the ugly old mole. "Oh, don't be obstinate, or I shall bite you with my sharp white teeth," said the field mouse. "You're getting a fine husband. The king himself does not possess such a velvet coat. His storeroom and cellar are full, and you should be thankful for that." The wedding day arrived. The mole had come to fetch Thumbelina to live with him deep down under the ground, never to come out into the warm sun again, for that was what he didn't like. The poor little girl was very sad, for now she must say goodbye to the beautiful sun. "Farewell, bright sun," she cried, stretching out her arms towards it and taking another step outside the house. Now the grain had been harvested, and only the stubble was left standing. "Farewell, farewell," she said, and put her arms around a little red flower that grew there. "Give my love to the dear swallow when you see him." She looked up. There was the swallow flying past. He was delighted when he saw Thumbelina. She told him how unwilling she was to marry the ugly mole, because then she'd have to live underground where the sun never shone, and while she said this she couldn't help bursting into tears. "The cold winter is coming now," said the swallow. "I must fly away to warmer lands. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back, and we will fly far away from the ugly mole and his dark house, over the mountains to the warm countries. There the sun shines much more brightly than here. There it's always summer, and beautiful flowers always bloom. Do come with me, dear little Thumbelina, who saved my life when I lay frozen in the dark tunnel." "Yes, yes, I'll go with you," said Thumbelina, and she climbed on the swallow's back with her feet on one of his outstretched wings. Up into the air he flew, over the woods and seas, over the great mountains always covered with snow. When she felt cold, she crept under his warm feathers, only keeping her little head out to admire all the beautiful things in the world beneath. At last they came to warm lands. There the sun was brighter, the sky seemed twice as high, and in the hedges hung the finest green and purple grapes. In the orchards grew oranges and lemons. The air was scented with myrtle and mint, and on the roads were pretty little children running about and playing with great gorgeous butterflies. But the swallow flew on farther, and the country became more and more beautiful. Under the most splendid green trees beside a blue lake stood a glittering white marble castle. Vines trailed from the high pillars, and at the top there were many swallows' nests. In one of these lived the swallow who was carrying Thumbelina. "Here's my house," said he, "but it won't do for you to live with me. I'm not tidy enough to please you. Find a home for yourself in one of the pretty flowers that grow down there. Now I will set you down, and you can do whatever you like." "That'll be lovely," said Thumbelina, clapping her hands. There lay a great white marble column, which had fallen to the ground and broken into 3 pieces. But between these grew the most beautiful white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her upon one of the broad leaves. There, to her astonishment, she found a tiny little man sitting in the middle of the flower, as white and transparent as if he were made of glass. He had the prettiest golden crown on his head and the most beautiful wings on his shoulders. He himself was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the spirit of the flower. In each blossom there lived a tiny man or woman, but this one was king of them all. "How handsome he is," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The little king was very much frightened by the swallow, for in comparison with one as tiny as himself, the bird seemed a giant. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, for she was the loveliest girl that he'd ever seen. He took his golden crown off his head and put it on hers, asking her her name and if she would be his wife, and then she would be queen of all the flowers. Yes, he was a different kind of husband from the son of the toad and the mole with the black velvet coat. So she said yes to the king. And out of each flower came a lady or a gentleman, so tiny and pretty that it was a pleasure to see them. Everyone brought Thumbelina a present, but the best of all was a pair of lovely wings which they fastened to her back, and now she too could fly from flower to flower. They wished her joy, and the swallow sat above in his nest and sang the wedding march as well as he could. But he was sad, as he was very fond of Thumbelina and didn't want to be separated from her. "You shall not be called Thumbelina," said the spirit of the flower. "That's an ugly name, and you're much too pretty. We will call you May Blossom. Farewell, farewell," said the little swallow with a heavy heart, and he flew away to other lands, far, far away, to the country of Denmark. There he had a little nest above the window of a man who tells such nice fairy stories. The name of the man was Hans Christian Andersen. Sang the swallow to the man. And that is how we learned the whole story.